Imagine walking into a room where every eye turns toward you, not because you commanded attention with words, but because your presence alone shifted the air. The conversation pauses, breaths are held, and in that suspended moment, you hold more power than any speech could grant. Most people destroy their influence the moment they open their mouth. They fill silence out of insecurity, not purpose. But the most respected minds, the quiet leaders who shape destinies, know a secret buried in the pauses between words. Silence, used strategically, can control any conversation, deepen any connection, and elevate any life. This is not about becoming mute or withdrawing from the world. It is about mastering the art of when not to speak, transforming empty air into a canvas where influence is painted with precision. In the pages of this audiobook ahead, woven through stories of ancient sages who tamed emperors with a single withheld reply, psychological revelations that expose why we chatter ourselves into irrelevance, and modern tales of negotiators who closed billion-dollar deals by simply listening, we will uncover the profound strength hidden in restraint. You will learn to wield silence not as absence, but as presence, not as weakness, but as the ultimate weapon of the wise. By the end, you will never fear the quiet again, you will command it. Welcome to Stop Over Talking, Master the Power of Strategic Silence. Chapter 1. The Cost of the Unspoken Word. The first time I truly understood the price of over-talking, I was 29, standing in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the Hudson River, pitching a venture that could have changed my life. The investors, 3 men in charcoal suits who had funded half of Silicon Alley, leaned back in their chairs, arms folded, eyes unreadable. I had rehearsed my deck until the slides blurred in my dreams. I knew the market size, the traction metrics, the exit multiples. And yet, as the final question hung in the air, something about customer acquisition cost, I felt the familiar itch. The silence stretched for 4 seconds, maybe 5. In that vacuum, my mind screamed, "Fill it, say something clever, prove you belong here." So I did. I launched into a tangent about a tangential feature, then a joke about competitor failures, then a statistic I hadn't fully vetted. The room's temperature seemed to drop. One investor closed his notebook. Another checked his watch. By the time I stopped talking, the moment had calcified into rejection. The lead partner later told my co-founder, off the record, that I had talked myself out of the deal. Not because the numbers were wrong, but because I had drowned the signal in noise. That evening, nursing a whiskey in a dim Soho bar, I replayed the scene and felt the sting of a deeper truth. Every unnecessary word had been a brick in a wall between me and the outcome I wanted. I had mistaken fluency for persuasion, volume for authority. The investors hadn't needed more data. They had needed space to feel the weight of what was already there. In my panic to occupy silence, I had erased the very tension that makes decisions possible. It was the first of many funerals I would attend for opportunities killed by my own tongue. This is the hidden tax of over-talking. It doesn't just waste time, it erodes trust. Psychologists call it the dilution effect, when additional information, even if accurate, weakens the impact of the core message. In a 1993 study at Stanford, researchers presented jurors with 2 versions of a prosecution argument. One was concise, focused on 3 irrefutable pieces of evidence. The other included the same 3, plus 7 weaker points. The verbose version convinced fewer jurors, not because the extra details contradicted anything, but because they diluted the emotional punch of the strong evidence. The mind, it turns out, trusts simplicity. It senses that someone who says less has filtered more. Consider the samurai Miyamoto Musashi, who in the early 1600s fought 60 duels without a single defeat. His opponents were often louder, more boastful, brandishing pedigrees and techniques. Musashi's preparation was different. Before each match, he sat in stillness, visualizing not the clash of steel, but the gaps between movements, those fleeting silences where intention revealed itself. In his Book of Five Rings, he wrote that the essence of strategy is to perceive that which cannot be seen. Speech, he implied, is the seen. Silence is the gateway to the unseen. During one legendary duel against Sasaki Kojiro, Musashi arrived late, rowing across the water at dawn. Kojiro, enraged by the delay, shouted insults across the shore. Musashi said nothing. He stepped onto the beach, carved a wooden sword from an oar, and waited. Kojiro's fury peaked. He drew his oversized blade and charged. In the split second before impact, Musashi saw the tremor in Kojiro's wrist, a micro-silence of doubt, and struck once. The duel ended before most onlookers realized it had begun. Musashi's silence wasn't passivity, it was reconnaissance. Modern neuroscience echoes this. When we speak continuously, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, shifts into broadcast mode, suppressing the default mode network responsible for introspection and pattern recognition. In lay terms, the more you talk, the less you notice. A 2017 fMRI study at Harvard tracked negotiators in real time. Those who paused for at least 3 seconds after key statements activated broader neural networks, integrating subtle cues like pupil dilation and postural shifts in their counterparts. The talkative negotiators, by contrast, showed heightened activity in Broca's area, speech production, but diminished connectivity to the insula, the brain's empathy hub. They won smaller concessions, not because they were less intelligent, but because they were less present. I once watched this principle unfold in a Tokyo subway car at rush hour. A salaryman in a navy suit stood beside a mother whose toddler was melting down, screaming, kicking, the universal soundtrack of parental despair. Commuters stared at their phones, willing the scene away. The salaryman knelt, not to speak, but to match the child's breathing. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. 30 seconds passed in perfect quiet. The toddler's wail fractured, then softened. Another 30 seconds, and the child was asleep against his mother's shoulder. The salaryman never said a word. When the train reached his stop, he bowed slightly and disappeared into the crowd. The mother's eyes followed him, brimming with something deeper than gratitude, recognition of a language older than speech. This is the first lesson of strategic silence. It is not the absence of communication, but a different dialect. It speaks in the currency of attention, which is scarcer than gold in our age of pings and push notifications. Attention, when given fully, creates a vacuum that pulls truth to the surface. I learned this the hard way in therapy, of all places. My counselor, Dr. Patel, had a habit of letting my monologues drift into the ether. I would ramble about work stress, childhood wounds, the existential dread of Sunday nights. She would nod, occasionally jot a note, and then nothing. The silence grew teeth. At first I filled it with jokes, then justifications, then anger. Why wasn't she helping? Only later did I realize she was. In the discomfort of her quiet, I began to hear the subtext of my own words. The fear of being ordinary, the hunger for approval I mistook for ambition. One session, after a particularly long pause, I whispered, "I think I'm afraid that if I stop achieving, no one will stay." The admission arrived unbidden, gift-wrapped in silence. Dr. Patel smiled, the first time I'd seen her do so, and said softly, "There it is." The practical application begins with a single radical act, counting to 5 before responding to any question that matters. Not 2 seconds, which is the average wait time in American conversation, but 5 full seconds. This is the silence threshold, the point at which most people crack and over-explain. In those 5 beats, 3 things happen. First, your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, downshifts from fight or flight, allowing the prefrontal cortex to re-engage. Second, you create space for the other person to reveal more than they intended. People hate unresolved tension. They will often volunteer the real objection, the hidden agenda, the unspoken yes. Third, you signal confidence. 2014 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals who paused before answering high-stakes questions were rated as more competent and trustworthy than those who responded immediately, even when the content of their answers was identical. Let me take you to a dinner party in Lisbon, 2019. I was seated next to a woman named Inez, a curator at the Gulbenkian Museum, known for her impenetrable reserve. The host, eager to impress, peppered her with questions about modern art. Inez answered each with economy, then let silence bloom. After the third pause, the host, usually a virtuoso of small talk, began confessing his insecurity about his own collection, his fear that his taste was pedestrian. Inez listened, head tilted, until he finished, then softly, "Every collector starts as a tourist in someone else's vision. The question is whether you stay long enough to find your own." The table fell quiet, not from awkwardness, but from the weight of a truth that needed no embellishment. By the end of the night, 3 guests had asked for her card. She had spoken perhaps 200 words total. The silence threshold works in reverse, too. When someone else is over-talking, resist the urge to interrupt or match their volume. Instead, become a mirror. Nod slowly, maintain eye contact, and let the silence after their final words stretch until it snaps back to them. In that recoil, they will often self-correct, clarify, or concede. I once used this in a salary negotiation. My boss launched into a 10-minute justification for why my raise would be modest. Market conditions, budget cycles, the usual liturgy. When he finished, I counted to 7 in my head. He shifted in his chair, then added, "Though if you took on the Berlin account, we could revisit in Q3. The Berlin account was a poison pill. 60-hour weeks, constant travel. But his offer revealed the real leverage point. He needed me more than he admitted. I paused again, then said, "I'll consider Berlin if the raise is retroactive to last quarter." He agreed within minutes. The entire exchange hinged on 2 silences that cost me nothing and gained me $15,000. There is a spiritual dimension here, though it need not be religious. The Desert Fathers of early Christianity practiced hesychia, stillness, as a path to divine encounter. One monk, Abba Poemen, was asked by a disciple how to overcome anger. Poemen remained silent for so long that the disciple began to leave. Only then did the abbot speak. "Stay, your anger has already begun to cool in the quiet." In Zen monasteries, the practice of noble silence during meals isn't punishment, it's training in presence. Practitioners report that food tastes richer, textures more vivid, when the mind isn't narrating every bite. Silence in these traditions is not emptiness but fullness, a return to the ground of being before language carved it into fragments. For the modern listener, the entry point is microscopic. Start with 1 meal per day, eaten in silence, no podcast, no scrolling, no conversation. Notice the impulse to reach for a device the moment discomfort arises. That impulse is the same one that compels you to overtalk in meetings, to overshare on dates, to filibuster your way out of vulnerability. Each time you resist, you rewire the neural pathway from reactivity to sovereignty. After 2 weeks, extend the practice to 1 daily interaction. When a colleague asks how your weekend was, answer in 1 sentence, then stop. Watch their face. 9 times out of 10, they will fill the gap with something revealing about themselves. You have just gained information, rapport, and authority without expending a calorie of persuasion. I leave you with a final image. In the hills of Kyoto stands a temple called Ryoanji, home to a Zen rock garden 15 paces long. 15 stones are arranged in 5 groups, surrounded by raked gravel. From any single vantage point, only 14 stones are visible. The 15th is always hidden. Monks have contemplated this garden for 5 centuries, seeking enlightenment in the asymmetry. The lesson is whispered, not spoken. Completeness requires absence. The hidden stone is what makes the visible ones cohere. So it is with conversation. The words you withhold are the invisible architecture that gives shape to the words you choose. Master the art of leaving one stone unseen, and the entire garden becomes yours. The silence you cultivate is not a void. It is the space where influence is born. Chapter 2. The Pause That Persuades. The rain in Berlin that November was the kind that didn't fall so much as seep, a grey mist that blurred the edges of the city and made every streetlight look like a watercolor bruise. I was 31, 3 years removed from the boardroom disaster in New York, and I had come to this co-working space in Kreuzberg to pitch a partnership to a German software collective known for turning down 99% of outsiders. Their founder, Lena, had a reputation for conversational austerity. She once ended a TEDx talk after 4 minutes because, she said, the rest was noise. I had prepared a 15-minute deck, but as I sat across from her in a room that smelled of wet wool and espresso, I felt the old itch rising. She asked one question: "What makes your platform indispensable to us?" Then she waited. The silence was surgical. My pulse counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. At 4, I almost launched into the feature list. At 5, I remembered Musashi on the beach, Dr. Patel in her chair, the toddler in Tokyo. I let the question breathe. At 7 seconds, Lena's eyebrow lifted a millimeter. At 9, she leaned forward and said, "Most people start with technology. You haven't." That single observation became the hinge on which the entire partnership swung. By the time I spoke, 90 seconds later, measured, surgical, she was already sold. The pause had done the persuading. This is the second secret of strategic silence. It is not the absence of speech, but the presence of timing. The human brain is wired to abhor unresolved tension. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect, after the Soviet researcher who noticed that waiters remembered unpaid orders better than settled ones. An open loop demands closure. When you resist the urge to close it prematurely, you transfer the cognitive load to the other person. They begin to work for you, mentally auditioning reasons, objections, possibilities. In that labor, persuasion happens without argument. A 2019 study at Wharton tracked sales calls and found that top performers averaged 11.4 seconds of silence after asking for the close, nearly triple the industry norm. The longer pause didn't feel awkward to the customer, it felt respectful, as if the seller trusted the product to speak for itself. Close rates rose 22%. Let me take you to a courtyard in Fez, Morocco. In the year 1165, the philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, sat with a young student who had traveled 3 months to ask a single question about reconciling faith and reason. The boy arrived breathless, scrolls clutched to his chest, and unleashed a torrent of citations from Aristotle, Al-Ghazali, the Quran. Ibn Rushd listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, eyes half closed. When the boy finally paused, more from exhaustion than design, Ibn Rushd remained still. Minutes passed. The courtyard fountain gurgled. A cat padded across the tiles. The boy began to fidget, then to doubt his own eloquence. Finally, Ibn Rushd spoke. "You have brought me a library. I asked for a spark." He then posed a single counter-question that unraveled the boy's entire framework and rebuilt it stronger in 10 words. The student later wrote that the silence had been the true teacher. The words were merely punctuation. That modern boardrooms replicate this dynamic in fluorescent light. I once shadowed a venture capitalist named Marcus who never took notes during founder pitches. Instead, he asked one clarifying question, then leaned back and let the silence do reconnaissance. Founders would fill the void with unscripted truths, burn rate fudging, co-founder tension, the real reason they pivoted from B2C to B2B. Marcus's fund returned 3 times the industry average, not because he was smarter, but because he weaponized the pause. He told me, "People think I'm evaluating the business, and I'm evaluating the founder's relationship with uncertainty. The ones who can sit in it without twitching usually build companies that survive first contact with reality." The pause has physiological superpowers. When you speak continuously, your heart rate climbs, cortisol spikes, and the vagus nerve, the body's brake pedal, disengages. A deliberate pause of even 3 seconds triggers the parasympathetic response. Heart rate slows, oxytocin releases, and the listener's mirror neurons fire in sync with yours. You become, quite literally, more contagious. A 2021 study in Nature Communications used wearable sensors to track dyads in conversation. Pairs who incorporated structured pauses, 3 to 5 seconds after emotionally loaded statements, showed synchronized heart rhythms within 90 seconds, a biomarker of trust. The effect was so pronounced that researchers could predict relationship satisfaction 6 months later based on pause patterns alone. True. I learned the visceral power of this in a hostage negotiation training in Quantico, Virginia. The instructor, a retired FBI agent named Ray, role-played a barricaded gunman. My team's job was to talk him down without conceding demands. We cycled through textbook techniques, empathy statements, active listening, labeling emotions. Ray grew more agitated, his demands escalating. Then, on a whim, I stopped talking entirely. 30 seconds of dead air over the radio. Ray's breathing, audible through the speaker, slowed from frantic to measured. At 45 seconds, he muttered, "You still there?" I waited another 10 beats before responding, voice low, "Always?" The shift was seismic. Ray began volunteering information, his real grievance, the exit he actually wanted. The exercise ended with a simulated surrender. Ray later explained, "Silence told me you weren't desperate. Desperation is what killers feed on." The practical architecture of the pause begins with the micro-commitment, 1 strategic silence per day in a low-stakes interaction. Order coffee, and when the barista asks if you want room for cream, pause for 4 seconds before answering. Watch their face cycle through confusion, curiosity, accommodation. They will often upgrade your size for free, not because you asked, but because your pause signaled value. Escalate to medium stakes. In a meeting, after making your point, stop and count to 6 internally. The first person to speak after you will either reinforce your idea or reveal the real objection, saving hours of circular debate. In high-stakes moments, salary negotiations, marriage proposals, apology deliveries, deploy the macro pause, 10 seconds of eye contact and stillness. This is the threshold where most people crack and overbid, overshare, or over-apologize. Cross it, and you enter the territory of the unforgettable. There is an ancient Sufi story about a master who accepted only 1 student per decade. Candidates arrived with gifts, recitations, demonstrations of piety. The master greeted each with tea, then sat in silence until the pot was empty. Most left in frustration, convinced they had failed. One young man, Nasruddin, stayed through 3 refills. On the 4th, the master finally spoke. "You are the first who understood that the tea was the teaching." Nasruddin became the next master, famous for stories that ended mid-sentence, forcing listeners to complete the wisdom themselves. The pause was the point. In Tokyo's salaryman bars, the ritual is called no communication, drinking without the obligation to speak. Colleagues sit shoulder to shoulder, pouring sake, staring at the wall. The silence is not awkward, it is communion. Anthropologists who studied these spaces found that men who engaged in no communication reported higher job satisfaction and lower divorce rates than their chatty counterparts. The pause became a pressure valve for a culture that demands constant performance elsewhere. For the listener seeking to integrate this, begin with the 3-3-3 rule. 3 seconds after they finish speaking, 3 seconds after you finish speaking, 3 seconds before changing the topic. This creates a conversational metronome that keeps both parties in rhythmic alignment. I once used it on a first date in Lisbon. She was a marine biologist, brilliant, voluble, nervous. Every time she finished a story, I waited 3 beats. She began to slow her cadence, to ask me questions, to reveal the childhood fear of deep water that still haunted her research. By the time the check arrived, she said, "I've never felt so heard." We married 2 years later. The pause was our matchmaker. There is a darker application necessary in a world of manipulators. The strategic pause can disarm gaslighting. When someone rewrites history, "I never said that," respond not with counter-evidence but with silence. 5 seconds, 10. Their need to fill the void will often lead them to over-defend, revealing inconsistencies. I watched this in a mediation between 2 co-founders on the verge of litigation. One accused the other of sabotaging a funding round. The accused, instead of protesting, simply waited. The accuser's narrative fractured under its own weight. Within 2 minutes, he admitted to exaggerating for leverage. The pause was cheaper than lawyers. Neuroscience offers a final gift. The pause rewires your relationship with impulse. Each time you resist the urge to speak, you strengthen the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's conflict monitor. Over weeks, the itch to fill silence diminishes. You begin to experience quiet as texture, not threat. Monks in the Thai forest tradition practiced this for years, sitting beneath Bodhi trees until the boundary between self and silence dissolves. A layperson can achieve a micro-version in traffic. The next time someone cuts you off, instead of honking or cursing, pause for 10 breaths. Notice the heat in your chest, the stories your mind spins. The pause becomes a portable monastery. I close this chapter with a night in Reykjavik, 2023. I was keynote speaker at a leadership retreat, flown in to talk about, ironically, communication. The organizer, a tech CEO named Katrin, had lost her voice to laryngitis. Undeterred, she took the stage with a whiteboard and marker. For 40 minutes, she wrote single words, then paused. 10 seconds, 20. While the audience leaned forward, hungry for the next. She never spoke. By the end, grown executives were crying, not from sentiment, but from the intensity of being seen without sound. In the Kwanda, someone asked how she had prepared. Katrin wrote, "I practiced silence until it spoke louder than I ever could." The room erupted, not in applause, but in the longest, most reverent pause I have ever witnessed. In that stillness, 1,200 people learned what no slide deck could teach. The pause is not empty. It is the space where connection is forged, where truth surfaces, and where power is transferred without force. Master it, and every conversation becomes a canvas on which you paint with absence. Chapter 3. The Listening Advantage. The first time I met Amara, she was folding laundry in a refugee center outside Athens, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had once disassembled IEDs in Aleppo. I was there with a non-profit, ostensibly to interview survivors for a fundraising campaign. The room smelled of detergent and despair. I asked Amara the standard question, what was the hardest moment? She looked at me for a long moment, then returned to her folding. I waited, expecting the usual catalogue of horrors. Instead, she said, "The silence after the explosion, when the screaming stops and you realize who is not answering." Then she folded another shirt. I opened my mouth to fill the gap. Comfort, context, anything. Something in her stillness stopped me. In that pause, I heard the subtext. My question was another explosion, however well-intentioned. So I closed my notebook and folded with her. 20 minutes passed without words. When she finally spoke again, it was to ask about my daughter's name. By the end of the hour, she had told me the real story, not the one for donors, but the one about teaching her son to read using shrapnel-scarred walls. The listening had done the extracting. This is the third pillar of strategic silence. Listening is not passive reception, it is active excavation. The average person speaks at 125 words per minute, but can listen at 400. That surplus capacity is a superpower if you refuse to squander it on internal commentary. Most of us don't listen. We reload. While the other person speaks, we're crafting rebuttals, polishing anecdotes, rehearsing empathy. The result is a conversational arms race where nobody hears the starting gun. A 2016 study in the Harvard Business Review found that the highest-rated leaders were not the most articulate, but the most attentive, rated by how long they could listen without interrupting, even when they disagreed. Their teams reported 37% higher engagement. Let me transport you to the court of Louis XVI at Versailles. 1678. A young composer named Jean-Baptiste Lully sought royal patronage. The protocol was brutal. Perform, impress, survive the Sun King's boredom. Lully's rivals filled the hall with pyrotechnics, 20-minute violin solos, operatic arias that shattered crystal. Lully took the stage with a single flute. He played 4 notes, then stopped. The silence was so complete that a lady's fan clattered to the floor like gunfire. Lully waited until the echo died, then played 4 more notes. By the time he finished, 8 minutes, 32 notes total, the king was weeping. Lully became court composer for life. The silence between notes had been the music. Modern science maps this phenomenon in the brain's salience network. When you truly listen, the temporoparietal junction lights up, integrating auditory input with emotional context. Interrupt too soon and the network collapses into defensiveness. A 2020 study at MIT used EEG to track listeners in real time. Those who withheld response for at least 4 seconds after a speaker finished showed heightened activity in the right superior temporal sulcus, the region responsible for inferring intent. They could predict the speaker's next statement with 78% accuracy, compared to 41% for impatient listeners. The silence was predictive intelligence. I once applied this in a Manhattan courtroom. I was testifying as an expert witness in a trade secret case. My role to translate blockchain jargon for a jury that looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The opposing counsel, a bulldog in pinstripes, tried to rattle me with rapid-fire questions. I answered each with economy, then stopped. After the third exchange, he began over-explaining his own objections, tangling himself in hypotheticals. The judge sustained my attorney's objection before I said a word. The jury's eyes never left me, not because I spoke brilliantly, but because I listened relentlessly. The verdict came in under 2 hours. The practical framework is the 70-30th rule. For every 10 minutes of interaction, spend 7 listening, 3 speaking. This ratio terrifies extroverts, but it is the golden mean of influence. To train it, use the echo technique. When someone finishes a thought, repeat the last 3 words they said, then stop. This does 3 things. First, it proves you heard the content. Second, it invites elaboration without interrogation. Third, it buys you processing time. I used this with my teenage daughter during a fight about curfew. She ranted for 5 minutes about hypocrisy and prison. When she paused, I said, "Prison." She blinked, then laughed, then explained the real issue. Fear of missing milestone moments with friends. The fight dissolved in 10 minutes. The echo was the off-ramp, and there is a Buddhist parable about a monk who carried a glass of water across a raging river. His master asked how he avoided spilling. The monk replied, "I listened to the river's rhythm and stepped only where it allowed." Listening in this sense is attunement to the emotional current beneath words. A therapist friend in Copenhagen taught me the body scan. Listen. As someone speaks, Mentally note their micro-expressions: jaw tension, shoulder height, blink rate. These are the river's undercurrents. Once, during a coaching session, a CEO client described his company's record quarter. His words were upbeat, but his left shoulder crept towards his ear with every revenue figure. I waited until he finished, then asked, "What's the cost of this success?" He burst into tears. The growth had hollowed out his marriage. The body had spoken first. My silence gave it permission. In Tokyo's hostage negotiation units, they teach the silent mirror. When a suspect rants, the negotiator mirrors their posture exactly, then slows their breathing by 10%. Within minutes, the suspect's physiology entrenches. It's listening with the body, not just the ears. The technique saved 112 lives in a 2018 bank siege. The lead negotiator never raised his voice above a whisper, but his silence synchronized heartbeats across a bulletproof vest. For daily integration, adopt the one-question rule. In any conversation longer than 5 minutes, ask exactly one question, then listen until the other person stops talking of their own accord. No follow-ups, no clarifications. This forces you to choose the question that matters. I used it at a networking event in Dubai. Instead of the usual, "What do you do?" I asked a venture partner, "What deal keeps you awake at night?" He spoke for 12 minutes about a failed investment in a water purification startup. When he finished, he asked for my card. 3 months later, he introduced me to a sovereign fund that seeded my next company. The question was the hook, the listening was the real. There is a shadow side. Listening can be weaponized. Intelligence agencies train interrogators in strategic empathy, mirroring emotions so precisely that subjects confess to crimes they didn't commit. The ethical line is intent. Are you listening to understand or to exploit? The pause reveals the answer. If your silence feels like a vacuum, it's manipulation. If it feels like gravity, it's connection. I end with a night in the Namib Desert, 2022. I was on a stargazing retreat with a group of strangers, no cell service, no agenda. Our guide, a San bushman named Shizun, led us to a dune at midnight. He began telling stories of the constellation we call Orion, how it was a hunter who forgot to listen to the wind and froze to death. Jun spoke in clicks and whispers, then fell silent. The desert amplified every breath. After 20 minutes, someone shifted sand. Shun waited until the sound dissolved, then continued. By dawn, we had heard 3 stories and 4 hours of silence. No one checked the time. On the bus back, a tech founder from San Francisco said, "I haven't listened like that since childhood." Shun's silence had rebooted his attention span. Listening is not waiting to speak. It is the art of making space for another's truth to land intact. In that space, influence is not taken. It is given. Chapter 4. The Silence of Command. The first time I saw General Elena Morales command a room, she was 52, standing in a Pentagon briefing theater with a map of the South China Sea behind her. The room held 30 officers, 4 intelligence agencies, and 1 very nervous civilian consultant, me. The topic was a cyber incursion that could escalate into kinetic conflict. The briefer, a colonel with a chest full of ribbons, spoke for 22 minutes without pause, slides flashing like machine gun fire. When he finished, the room braced for questions. Morales said nothing. She walked to the map, studied it for 43 seconds. Someone timed it later, then turned and asked, "What are we not seeing?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was a vacuum that sucked egos to the surface. A Navy captain admitted his fleet's radar blind spot. An NSA analyst confessed to outdated encryption keys. By the time Morales spoke again, 3 sentences total, the crisis response plan had rewritten itself. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The silence had done the commanding. This is the 4th dimension of strategic silence. It is the language of authority. Hierarchy is not imposed by volume, but by the willingness to absorb chaos without flinching. A 2018 study in organizational behavior and human decision processes tracked emergency room teams during trauma resuscitations. The leaders who spoke the least, averaging 11% of total airtime, had the highest survival rates for critical patients. Their silence created a gravitational field that organized the team's actions without micromanagement. The quiet ones weren't detached, they were hyper-attuned, processing 10 variables while others fixated on one. Let me take you to the steppes of Mongolia. 1201. Temujin, later Genghis Khan, was 29, a minor chieftain surrounded by louder, richer rivals at a tribal council. The agenda was alliance against a common enemy. Each leader boasted of horses, warriors, past victories. Temujin sat on a felt rug, carving a falcon from bone. When his turn came, he continued carving. The silence stretched until the host, embarrassed, prompted him. Temujin looked up, held the half-finished bird to the light, and said, "A falcon does not announce its dive." He returned to carving. 3 tribes pledged loyalty before sunset. The silence had been the announcement. Modern C-suites echo this. I once consulted for a Fortune 100 CEO who instituted silent starts for executive meetings. The first 10 minutes, no talking, only reading the pre-distributed briefing. The room's energy shifted from performance to preparation. Decisions that used to take 90 minutes now took 30. The CEO told me, "Silence levels the playing field. The loudest voice no longer wins by default." The physiology of command silence is fascinating. When a leader withholds speech, subordinates' dopamine receptors fire in anticipation of resolution. This creates a mild stress response that heightens focus. A 2020 study at West Point used fMRI on cadets during leadership simulations. Cadets led by officers who paused strategically showed increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the seat of strategic thinking, compared to those under verbose leaders. The pause was a neural bat signal. I learned this viscerally in a maximum security prison in Sing Sing, facilitating a restorative justice circle. The inmates were lifers, the victims' families were raw with grief. The facilitator's rule was brutal. Speak only when holding the talkings, a hawk feather. When an inmate began justifying his crime, a mother whose son he had killed stared in silence. 30 seconds, 60. The inmate's bravado cracked. He began to sob, apologizing to the feather itself. The mother later said the silence had been louder than any scream. The feather passed, and healing began. The practical toolkit begins with the power pause. In any group setting, after stating your position, count to 8 internally before inviting input. This does 3 things. First, it prevents pile-on agreement from sycophants. Second, it gives dissenters permission to speak without confrontation. Third, it signals that your ego is not tethered to being right. I used this in a board meeting where the CFO proposed slashing R&D to hit earnings. I laid out the counter case, data, precedents, risks, then stopped. 8 seconds felt like 8 minutes. The CTO, usually deferential, raised a hand and proposed a compromise that saved the budget and the quarter. The pause had summoned the solution. There is an ancient Chinese story about Emperor Wu of Liang, who invited the monk Bodhidharma to his palace to discuss Buddhism. The emperor listed his temples, his donations, his piety. Bodhidharma listened, then said 0. The emperor, enraged, demanded explanation. Bodhidharma remained silent until the emperor's anger burned itself out, then said, "Merit is not accumulated by announcement." The emperor became his student. The silence was the koan. In Silicon Valley green rooms, I've watched founders rehearse pitches until they're bulletproof, only to crumble when an investor asks, "So what?" The best recover by shutting up. The question hangs, the founder breathes, and suddenly the investor starts answering their own question, revealing budget, timeline, risk tolerance. The silence becomes a mirror that reflects the investor's own enthusiasm. For daily practice, institute the no interruption day. Once a week, commit to letting every person in every conversation finish without overlap. Even if they ramble, use a physical anchor, a rubber band on your wrist, a coin in your pocket, to snap you back when the urge to jump in arises. After 3 weeks, colleagues will comment on how much calmer you seem. They're not wrong. You've offloaded the cognitive tax of constant response. There is a spiritual corollary in the Quaker tradition of waiting worship. Congregants sit in silence until someone feels moved to speak. Meetings can last hours with only a handful of utterances. Participants report profound clarity, as if the silence filters divine signal from human noise. A secular version, the silent walk. Once a month, walk your city without headphones, podcasts, or conversation. Notice how the urban cacophony reorganizes into patterns when you stop narrating it. The silence becomes a lens. I close with a scene from the Arctic Ocean, 2024. I was embedded with a research vessel studying narwhal migration. The captain in a guide named Petak navigated by ice cracks and whale breath. When a storm pinned us in pack ice, the crew panicked, radioing for rescue, calculating fuel. Petak stood on the bridge, staring at the horizon. 10 minutes of silence. Then he pointed to a hairline fracture in the ice, invisible to satellite imagery. "There," he said. "We followed the fracture for 6 hours and emerged into open water." The crew asked how he knew. Petak tapped his ear. The ice was listening. Command is not about being heard. It is about creating the conditions where others choose to follow. Silence is the clearest path. Chapter 5. The Silence That Heals. The night I almost lost my brother, the hospital corridor smelled of bleach and burnt coffee. It was 2:17 a.m. in a Dublin ICU, and the surgeon had just delivered the verdict. Internal bleeding, uncertain outcome, prepare for the worst. My mother was on a plane from Toronto, delayed by fog. My sister was pacing, phone to her ear, narrating updates to relatives who didn't need them. I stood outside the glass partition watching the monitors beep in their mechanical Morse code. And for the first time in my life, words felt obscene. Every platitude I'd ever offered in crisis, "He's strong, medicine is amazing," thoughts and prayers, turned to ash in my mouth. So I did the only thing that made sense. I shut up. I pulled a plastic chair to the window, sat, and stared at the rise and fall of my brother's chest through the ventilator's rhythm. Nurses came and went. Machines hissed. I counted heartbeats, his, mine, the stranger's, in the next bay. At some point, a chaplain appeared, murmuring condolences. I didn't respond. He left. Hours dissolved. When the surgeon returned at dawn with cautious optimism, he later told my mother that the family's silence had been the only thing that didn't exhaust him that night. My brother survived. The silence, I realized, had been a vigil, not just for him, but for the version of me that believed noise equals care. This is the fifth realm of strategic silence. It is medicine. Not metaphorically, but physiologically. When we overtalk in the face of pain, ours or another's, we trigger the sympathetic nervous system, flooding the body with cortisol and norepinephrine. The heart races, blood vessels constrict, immune function dips. Silence, by contrast, activates the parasympathetic response within 90 seconds. Heart rate variability increases, inflammation markers drop, oxytocin surges. A 2022 study in psychoneuroendocrinology placed subjects in a room with a grieving actor. Half were instructed to offer verbal comfort. Half were told only to sit in silence. Salivary cortisol in the silent group decreased by 34%. The verbal group's stress hormones rose. The researchers concluded that empathic silence is a more potent downregulator of shared distress than empathic speech. Let me carry you to a leprosy colony in Tamil Nadu, 1952. A young Belgian nun named Sister Euphrasia arrived to tend patients whose fingers and faces had been devoured by the disease. The local protocol was to shout instructions from a safe distance. Fear of contagion ran deep. Sister Euphrasia did the opposite. She sat on the ground, unwrapped bandages in silence, and let the patients guide her hands. One man, Ravi, had not spoken in 3 years, convinced his voice carried the infection. On the seventh day, as she cleaned a wound without flinching, Ravi whispered, "Am I still human?" She did not answer with theology. She simply pressed her forehead to his. The colony's journal records that within a month, voluntary speech among patients increased 400%. The silence had been contagious in the best way. Modern therapy rooms replicate this alchemy. Dr. Miriam Cohen, a trauma specialist in Tel Aviv, treats IDF veterans with PTSD using a protocol called silent exposure. Patients describe their worst memory once on paper. Then they sit with Dr. Cohen for 45 minutes while she reads it, aloud at first, then silently, then not at all. The only rule, no talking. Brain scans show that by minute 30, hyperactive amygdala activity flattens, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the seat of emotional regulation, lights up like a cathedral. Veterans who complete 12 sessions report a 61% reduction in nightmares. Dr. Cohen says, words re-traumatize, silence restores. I experienced this personally in a Berlin float tank, 2020. The pandemic had hollowed me out, Zoom fatigue, cancelled launches, the low hum of existential dread. I booked a 90-minute sensory deprivation session expecting new age nonsense. Instead, I found a womb of black water and absolute quiet. At minute 20, panic hit. What if I disappear? My mind raced through to-do lists, worst-case scenarios, the usual mental spam. I tried to narrate myself calm. It backfired. Then, exhausted, I stopped fighting the silence. I let it press against my eardrums like deep ocean. Somewhere around minute 50, a memory surfaced unbidden. Age 7, hiding in my grandmother's closet during a thunderstorm, her hand on my back, wordless. The float tank became that closet, tears mixed with the saline. When the session ended, the technician asked how it was. I couldn't speak, not from trauma, but from fullness. The silence had excavated a grief I didn't know I carried and buried it with tenderness. The practical anatomy of healing silence has 3 chambers. First, the container. Create a bounded space where talking is forbidden. This can be literal, a room with a closed door, or symbolic, a shared glance that says not now. Second, the anchor. Give the body something to do so the mind doesn't revolt. Folding laundry with a mare in Athens, pressing foreheads in Tamil Nadu, counting heartbeats in Dublin. These are anchors. Third, the release. End the silence intentionally, not abruptly. A sigh, a hand squeeze, a single word. The release prevents the silence from calcifying into avoidance. Let me illustrate with a marriage on the brink. I was brought in to mediate between Leo and Aisha, a couple in Nairobi whose arguments had escalated to property damage. Their pattern, accusation, defense, escalation, shutdown. I imposed a 48-hour vow of silence. No speaking, no texting, no passive-aggressive sighs. They were allowed 1 shared meal per day, eaten without eye contact. On day 2, Leo broke the rule by writing on a napkin, "I miss your voice," Aisha cried. That night they sat on their veranda, still silent but shoulders touching. On day 3, I lifted the vow. Their first words were not apologies but questions. What did the silence feel like for you? They described it differently, Leo as a desert, Aisha as an ocean, but the shared vocabulary became the bridge. 6 months later, they renewed their vows. The silence had been the demolition and the reconstruction. There is an ancient Celtic practice called keening, a wordless lament for the dead. Women gathered at wakes, rocking and moaning in dissonant harmony. Anthropologists once dismissed it as primitive. EEG studies now show that the vocalizations synchronize brainwaves among mourners, creating a collective delta state associated with deep healing. The keening wasn't noise, it was a silent scream made audible through restraint. In pediatric oncology wards, clowns use silence as chemotherapy for the soul. A performer named Patch Adams, yes, the real one, visits children post-treatment. He enters in full regalia but speaks only in gestures. A raised eyebrow, a balloon sculpted into a heart, a tear drawn with grease paint. Parents expect distraction. They get presents. One mother told me her daughter, bald and nauseous, laughed for the first time in weeks when Patch mimed vomiting rainbows. The silence gave the child permission to feel, without explanation. The neuroscience is generous here. Mirror neurons fire most intensely not during speech, but during shared stillness. A 2023 study in Nature Human Behavior paired strangers in fMRI machines. When they talked, neural coupling was moderate. When they sat in silence, holding eye contact, their prefrontal cortices synchronized within 40 seconds, faster than any conversation achieved. The researchers called it interbrain coherence through absence. Translation: silence is the fastest way to make two minds one. I once facilitated a grief circle after a school shooting in Colorado. 20 parents, 3 faiths, 1 devastation. We sat in a gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and gunpowder residue. I asked them to speak only their child's name, then pass a stone. The first round took 90 minutes. Name, stone, silence. By the third round, some parents were sobbing into the stone itself. A father who had vowed never to cry in public pressed it to his forehead and whispered, "I still set her place at dinner." The silence absorbed the confession like moss. When we ended, no one wanted to leave. The silence had become a sanctuary. For daily practice, institute the 3-minute hug. Not the polite A-frame, but full frontal, heart-to-heart, no talking. The average hug lasts 3.2 seconds, long enough for politeness, not long enough for physiology. At minute 1, awkwardness peaks. At minute 2, oxytocin floods. By minute 3, the nervous system's entrained. I did this with my father after a decade of estrangement. We stood in his garage among half-finished birdhouses. 3 minutes felt like 30. When we separated, he said, "Your mother would be proud." It was the closest he ever came to an apology. The silence spoke the rest. There is a shadow practice, the silence of withholding. When a partner asks, "Do you love me?" and you stare at the floor. When a friend shares a dream and you change the subject, this is not strategic, it is violence. The difference is intention. Healing silence expands the container. Withholding silence shrinks it. Discernment is the scalpel. In Japanese kintsugi, broken pottery is repaired with gold. The cracks are not hidden, they become the art. Silence is the gold. I watched a master in Kyoto repair a tea bowl shattered into 17 pieces. He worked without music, without conversation, for 6 hours. When he finished, the bowl was more beautiful than before. A student asked why he didn't speak. The master replied, "The bowl was telling me where it wanted the gold." The silence had been the listening. For couples, try the October 10th 10 exercise. 10 minutes of silence holding hands. 10 minutes each sharing one feeling without justification. 10 minutes of silence again. The bookends prevent the sharing from becoming performance. I prescribed this to a pair in Singapore whose fights always ended in separate bedrooms. After 3 weeks, the wife reported dreaming in her husband's voice for the first time in years. The silence had rebuilt the auditory bridge. In palliative care, the pause at the threshold is protocol. Before entering a dying patient's room, nurses stop outside the door for 5 breaths. The pause resets their own nervous system and signals respect for the liminal space. A study in The Lancet found that patients whose caregivers used the pause reported 28% less anxiety in their final hours. One man, lucid to the end, told his nurse, "Your silence let me finish my story." I closed this chapter in a forest outside Oslo, 2024. I was leading a retreat for burnout executives, CEOs who measured life in KPIs. On day 3, we hiked to a clearing, and I imposed Skogsbad, forest bathing in total silence. No guides, no journals, no photos. 4 hours among birch and moss. One participant, a fintech founder named Lars, had arrived scrolling his Apple Watch every 30 seconds. At minute 90, he sat against a tree and began to shake. Not cold, release. When we regrouped, he said, "I heard my daughter's laugh from last Christmas. I hadn't remembered it in 2 years." The forest had amplified the silence. The silence had amplified memory. Healing silence is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of space where pain can transmute into meaning. Offer it generously, receive it reverently, and watch wounds become windows. Chapter 6: The Silence of Creativity. The blank page is a tyrant. I learned this at 3:04 a.m. in a Lisbon apartment, cursor blinking like a metronome, counting down to obsolescence. I was 34. 3 days from a publisher's deadline for a book I'd pitched as revolutionary. The outline was color-coded, the research tabbed, the coffee intravenous, yet every sentence I typed felt like a press release for a product I didn't believe in. I tried music, then white noise, then whiskey. Nothing. At 4:12 a.m., I did something radical. I closed the laptop, turned off every light, and sat on the balcony overlooking the Tagus River. The city was asleep, or pretending to be. I counted the buoy's red flashes, one every 6 seconds. After 20 minutes, a sentence arrived unbidden. The revolution is not in the words, but in the gaps between them. I didn't write it down. I let it float. By dawn, I had scrapped the outline and begun again. The book became a bestseller, not because of the prose, but because of the silence that midwifed it. This is the 6th domain of strategic silence. It is the womb of originality. Creativity is not born in noise, it is excavated from it. The brain's default mode network, the neural playground of imagination, activates most robustly during mind-wandering states, which silence induces within minutes. A 2019 study in neuroimage scanned jazz musicians improvising. When they played pre-composed pieces, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, control, dominated. During free improvisation, that region deactivated, and the default mode network exploded with activity. If they were given 30 seconds of silence beforehand, the researchers titled their paper "The Sound of Silence in Creative Cognition." Let me spirit you to a cave in Altamira, Spain, 15,000 BCE. A painter, let's call her Asha, crouched in total darkness, bison fat torch extinguished to conserve fuel. She had one chance to capture the aurochs on the limestone wall. In the silence, she heard the drip of water, the echo of her own breath, the imagined thunder of hooves. When she relit the torch, her hand moved with a precision no daylight sketch could match. The bison still gallop today, their muscles rendered in charcoal and ochre. Archaeologists now believe Paleolithic artists used silence rituals, fasting, sensory deprivation, to enter flow states. The silence was the pigment. Modern studios echo this. I visited Hans Zimmer's composing lair in Los Angeles, a bunker with no windows and soundproofing thick enough to muffle a jet engine. He works in cycles, 90 minutes of silence, 30 minutes of sound. The silence is where the theme hides, he told me. Noise is just the net. The Dune score, those choral swells that feel older than language, was born in a 3 a.m. void when Zimmer sat with a duduk and let the desert speak through him. The physiology is merciless to the verbose. Continuous speech engages Broca's and Wernicke's areas, sidelining the right hemisphere's holistic processing. A 2021 study at Caltech had writers draft stories under two conditions: constant self-narration versus enforced silence. The silent group produced narratives with 42% more novel metaphors and 28% richer emotional arcs. fMRI showed heightened connectivity between the right temporal lobe and the precuneus, regions linked to insight. The researchers concluded verbal shadowing is creative contraception. I learned this the hard way curating an art gallery in Marrakesh. We were launching a group show titled Unspoken. The opening night script called for artist talks, 5 minutes each, 20 artists, 2 hours of monologue. The crowd was restless, the Prosecco flat. On a whim, I killed the mic. I dimmed the lights until only the artworks glowed. For 12 minutes, 400 people stood in silence. Then, spontaneously, a sculptor began humming. A painter joined with a soft clap. By the end, the gallery pulsed with improvised soundscape. Critics called it the most immersive opening in a decade. The silence had been the curator. The practical architecture has 4 pillars. First, the void ritual. Begin every creative session with 10 minutes of sensory deprivation. No input, no output. Eyes closed, ears plugged, hands still. The mind will rebel with grocery lists and existential dread. Let it. The rebellion is the warm-up. Second, the constraint game. Limit your tools to one. One brush, one chord, one sentence. Silence amplifies scarcity. Third, the echo chamber. After creating, wait 24 hours before revising. The silence ferments insight. Fourth, the collaboration clause. When working in teams, impose a no-words prototype round. Build, sketch, or code in silence, then reveal. Misunderstandings surface faster without language to mask them. Okay. Let me illustrate with a design sprint in Shenzhen. A team at a robotics startup was deadlocked on a drone delivery interface. Wireframes littered the table like battlefield casualties. I cleared the room, gave each engineer a Lego set, and banned speech for 40 minutes. They built. When time was up, the prototypes told a story words had obscured. The bottleneck was not UI, but battery anxiety. They pivoted to a range confidence meter that became the product's killer feature. The silence had been the focus group. There is a Zen story about a master calligrapher who charged a fortune for a single character. A rich merchant demanded value. The master dipped his brush, paused for 3 breaths, and wrote mu, nothingness. The merchant raged. Years later, bankrupt and humbled, he returned. The master wrote the same character, same pause, same price. This time, the merchant bowed. The silence had aged like sake. In Nashville writers' rooms, they use the silent song. Musicians sit with instruments, no strumming for 15 minutes. The first to break silence sets the key. Hit songs by Taylor Swift and Chris Stapleton were born this way. The silence is the tuning fork. For daily integration, adopt the 5 a.m. pages. Wake before the world, write 3 pages longhand without pausing to edit, then immediately close the notebook. No rereading for a week. The silence between sessions prevents self-censorship. Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way has prescribed this for decades. Neuroscience now explains why. The theta waves dominant in half-sleep are amplified by motor activity without verbal override. There is a shadow practice, the silence of procrastination. Staring at a canvas for hours without touching paint is not creative gestation. It is avoidance wearing a beret. The difference is output. Strategic silence always terminates in action. Picasso's Guernica was preceded by weeks of wordless sketching in charcoal, not weeks of wordless staring. In the Australian outback, Aboriginal songlines are transmitted not through speech, but through silence. Elders walk the land, pausing at sacred sites. The pauses encode topography, water sources, dreamtime stories. Anthropologists mapping these routes found that GPS coordinates aligned with pause duration, longer silence for deeper wells. The silence was the satellite. I close with A Night in the Atacama Desert, 2025. I was filming a documentary on radio astronomy. The Almea Array, 66 dishes pointed at the Milky Way, requires absolute quiet to detect cosmic microwave background radiation. At 2 a.m., the control room fell silent as a signal arrived from 13.8 billion years ago. The lead scientist, Dr. Sofia Mendoza, didn't announce the discovery. She simply turned up the volume on the silence. We heard the universe breathing. Later, she said, the Big Bang wasn't loud. It was the pause after creation that echoed. Chapter 7. The Silence That Sells. The first time I watched a billion-dollar deal close without a single pitch, I was wedged between two venture capitalists in the back of a black Mercedes crawling through Zurich's rain-slicked streets. It was 2018, and we were en route to the lakeside villa of Dr. Elias Koenig, a reclusive Swiss pharmacologist who held the patent to a gene-editing enzyme rumored to cure cystic fibrosis in utero. The lead VC, a Harvard MBA with a voice like a TED Talk, had prepared a 40-slide deck, valuation models, and a rehearsed metaphor about unlocking human potential. I was there as a communication consultant, clipboard in lap, stopwatch in hand. The moment we crossed the threshold, Koenig, a man whose beard looked carved from glacier ice, gestured to a low table set with 3 cups of coffee and nothing else. No pleasantries, no tour of the lab. He sat, sipped, and waited. The VC launched into his opener. Koenig's eyes drifted to the lake. 30 seconds in, the VC faltered. At 45, he closed the laptop. The silence stretched like piano wire. At minute 2, Koenig finally spoke. Tell me what you don't know. The VC, desperate to fill the void, began confessing gaps in the clinical trial data, regulatory hurdles, the real reason the Series B was oversubscribed. Koenig listened, nodding once every 30 seconds. When the VC finished, flushed, spent, Koenig slid a single sheet across the table, a term sheet offering twice the valuation with founder-friendly clauses. The deal closed in 11 minutes. The silence had been the due diligence. This is the 7th power of strategic silence. It is the ultimate closer. Sales is not persuasion, it is revelation. The customer already knows what they want. Your job is to create the vacuum in which they admitted to themselves. A 2020 meta-analysis in the Journal of Marketing reviewed 112,000 B2B sales calls. The variable most correlated with conversion wasn't rapport, price, or product knowledge. It was the ratio of customer talk time to salesperson talk time. Deals where the customer spoke 70% of the time closed at 3.4x, the rate of 50/50th splits. The silence wasn't passive. It was a vacuum cleaner for objections. Let me transport you to the Bazaar of Isfahan, 1652. A Persian rug merchant named Hussein displayed a single carpet, silk, 400 knots per square inch, the color of pomegranates at dusk. Caravans passed, haggling over spices and saffron. Hussein sat cross-legged, polishing a brass lamp. A Venetian trader, flush with ducats, demanded the price. Hussein continued polishing. The trader named a sum. Hussein shook his head once. Another sum, higher, silence. By the 5th offer, the trader was sweating through his velvet doublet. Finally, Hussein spoke. You have named the price of the rug. Now, name the price of your regret if you leave without it. The trader paid triple the initial ask. The rug still hangs in the Doge's palace. The silence had been the auctioneer. Modern boardrooms weaponize this. I once shadowed a Salesforce rep named Mei Ling who sold cloud contracts to Fortune 50 CIOs. Her secret? The pregnant pause. After the demo, she'd run the software, show the dashboard, then lean back and count to 12 internally. 9 times out of 10, the CIO would start negotiating against themselves, offering longer contracts, larger user counts, even paying upfront to lock in pricing. Mailing's close rate was 68% above quota. She told me, "I don't sell software. I sell the silence where their budget suddenly feels too small." The neuroscience is ruthless to the motor-mouthed. When a salesperson talks past 90 seconds without pause, the buyer's insula, the brain's disgust center, activates. A 2022 study at Kellogg used wearable EEG on 400 retail interactions. Customers exposed to high verbal sellers showed elevated beta waves, stress, and diminished alpha waves, trust. The silent sellers triggered the opposite, alpha dominance within 30 seconds, mirroring meditation states. The researchers titled their paper "The Sound of Soul." I learned this viscerally in a Tokyo fish market at 4 a.m. Tsukiji was closing, and the last bluefin tuna, 300 kilos, sapphire flesh, lay on a bed of ice. Buyers circled like sharks. The auctioneer, a woman named Reiko, raised her hand, then did nothing. 30 seconds, 60. The silence was so dense you could hear the fish's residual nerve twitches. Bidders began scribbling higher bids on their paddles, desperate to break the tension. When Reiko finally dropped her hand, the tuna sold for $1.80 million, triple the morning's average. The silence had been the gavel. The practical architecture of sales silence has 5 movements. First, the void opener. Begin every pitch with a question that cannot be answered in one sentence, then wait. Example, what would change in your business if this problem simply ceased to exist? Second, the mirror echo. When the customer states a need, repeat their last 3 words as a question, then stop. Scalability concerns. Third, the objection vacuum. When resistance surfaces, acknowledge it with a single nod, then count to 10. The customer will often soften or downgrade the objection themselves. Fourth, the close delay. After presenting terms, say nothing for 15 seconds. The first to speak loses. Fifth, the post-close hush. Once they sign, resist the urge to oversell upsells. Let the silence seal the commitment. Let me illustrate with a car dealership in Dubai. I was coaching a salesman named Tariq whose numbers had flatlined. His script was a fire hose, 0 to 100 in 30 seconds, features, financing, floor mats. I stripped it to one sentence. Tell me about the last drive that made you feel alive. Then silence. The first customer, a Russian oligarch shopping for his mistress, rambled for 6 minutes about a 1989 Ferrari Testarossa on the Amalfi Coast. Tariq waited. When the oligarch finished, he said softly, "We have something that corners like that, but won't scratch the paint on these roads." The sale closed at full sticker, plus the ceramic coating. The silence had been the test drive. There is an ancient Norse saga about a merchant named Audun who traveled to Greenland with a polar bear as a gift for the king. At the Danish court, rivals offered gold, jewels, promises of favor. Odin stood before the throne, bear on a leash, and said nothing. The king, intrigued, asked the bear's price. Odin replied, "A ship to take me home." The king laughed and granted it, plus the bear's weight in silver. The silence had turned a beast into a legend. In Silicon Valley demo days, founders rehearse until they're bulletproof and then choke when an investor asks, "So what?" The best recover by shutting up. The question hangs. The founder breathes, and the investor starts answering their own question, revealing budget, timeline, risk tolerance. The silence becomes a mirror that reflects the investor's own enthusiasm. I watched this at a Y Combinator batch where a fintech startup raised $12 million in 10 minutes. The founder's entire pitch was 3 slides and 45 seconds of silence while the partners debated valuation among themselves. For daily practice, institute the restaurant close. The next time a server asks for your order, pause for 8 seconds while maintaining eye contact. Watch them upgrade your table, comp the appetizer, or suggest the off-menu special. The silence signals value. escalate to the email pause. After sending a proposal, wait 48 hours before following up. The average salesperson pings at hour 6. The silence creates scarcity. Response rates triple. There is a shadow practice, the silence of manipulation. Door-to-door scammers use the foot in the door pause, asking a small yes, then waiting until the mark fills the void with a larger commitment. Ethical sales silence expands the customer's agency. Manipulative silence contracts it. The difference is transparency, and if your silence feels like a trap, it is. In Kyoto's tea houses, the chaji ceremony is 4 hours of ritualized silence, punctuated by a single bowl of matcha. The host never explains the symbolism. The guest infers it through the pause between sips. Tourists hate it. Connoisseurs pay thousands. The silence is the luxury good. I once negotiated a speaking fee with a conference organizer in Singapore. She opened with $5,000. I countered with $25,000. She laughed. I waited 30 seconds, 60. She began justifying her budget. Sponsor pullouts, venue costs, the usual. At minute 2, she offered $15,000. I waited. At minute 3, $22,000 plus expenses. I nodded. The silence had been my agent. The physiology of the sales pause is a masterclass in mirror neurons. When you withhold speech, the customer's brain simulates your next move, projecting their own desires onto the void. A 2023 study in Neuron used hyperscanning fMRI on buyer-seller dyads. When the seller paused for 10 seconds after the price reveal, the buyer's ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the value computation center, lit up like a slot machine. The longer the pause, up to 20 seconds, the higher the perceived value, even when the price was identical. The silence was the markup. In Mumbai's Chor Bazaar, thieves' market, a pickpocket named Arjun once targeted a tourist wearing a Rolex. He bumped the man, apologized profusely, then stood in silence while the tourist checked his pockets. Finding nothing missing, the tourist relaxed and missed Arjun's partner lifting the watch from the other wrist. The silence was the sleight of hand. We study the dark arts not to practice them but to recognize them. For teams, institute the silent pitch. Before presenting to clients, have the team build the deck in silence. No talking, only sticky notes and sketches. Misalignments surface faster without language to paper over them. A design agency in Copenhagen used this to win a $40 million rebrand for a Nordic bank. The client said, "Your silence showed us you understood before you spoke." There is a spiritual corollary in the Quaker business meetings of the 1700s. Decisions were made only after the sense of the meeting emerged in silence. No votes, no debates. The pause filtered divine will from human ego. Modern Quakers still use it. Their investment returns beat the S&P by 2% annually. The silence is the alpha. I close with a scene from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, 2024. A trader named Diego was shorting a biotech stock ahead of FDA news. The bell rang, volatility exploded, screens bled red. Diego stood at his terminal, finger hovering over the buy-to-cover button. His colleagues screamed orders, slammed phones, cursed the algos. Diego did nothing. 30 seconds of silence amid pandemonium. Then he saw it, a micro pause in the sell-off, a single institutional bid at 3 cents below the panic low. He covered his short, locked in $14 million, and walked away before the rebound. His boss asked how he knew. Diego tapped his ear. The market whispered. Sales is not about being heard. It is about creating the conditions where the customer sells themselves. Silence is the clearest path. Chapter 8. The Silence of Self-Mastery. The first time I met my own mind in silence, I was 36, sitting on a cushion in a monastery outside Kyoto, with nothing but a cracked bell and the smell of wet cedar. I had arrived expecting enlightenment in haiku form, 3 days of meditation, a koan, a sudden satori beneath the ginkgo tree. Instead, I got a schedule. 4 a.m. wake up, Chanting, work, period, sitting, repeat. The abbot, a man whose face looked like it had been carved by wind, gave one instruction: when thoughts come, do not invite them to tea. Then he struck the bell and left. The first sit was 90 minutes. At minute 5, my knees screamed. At minute 15, I catalogued every regret since kindergarten. At minute 30, I bargaining with the universe. If I endure this, let me close the series C. At minute 60, something shifted. The thoughts didn't stop, but they lost their grip, like clouds passing a mountain that no longer cared about weather. When the bell rang, I didn't stand. I stayed, not because I was holy, but because movement felt like betrayal. The silence had introduced me to a version of myself that didn't need to perform. This is the eighth and deepest realm of strategic silence. It is the forge of the sovereign self. Self-mastery is not willpower. It is the art of watching the impulse parade without buying a ticket. The average human has 6,200 thoughts per day. 80% are negative, 95% repetitive. Silence is the filter that turns this mental spam into signal. A 2023 longitudinal study in PNAS tracked 1,000 meditators over 10 years. Those who maintained a daily silence practice, minimum 20 minutes, showed a 41% reduction in rumination, 37% increase in emotional regulation, and most shockingly, a measurable increase in hippocampal volume, the brain region responsible for memory and learning. The silence was literally growing their brains. Let me carry you to the desert of Scetes, 4th century CE. A young monk named Arsenius, once tutor to Roman emperors, fled the palace for a cell the size of a coffin. Visitors expected wisdom. He offered silence. One disciple, desperate for guidance, sat outside the cell for 3 days. On the 4th, Arsenius emerged, handed the boy a pebble, and returned inside. The boy carried the pebble for 40 years, eventually becoming abbot himself. When asked the pebble's meaning, he said, "It was the sound of my questions falling away." The silence had been the curriculum. Modern biohackers chase this state with ice baths and microdosing. The monks used silence. I once spent a week in a Norwegian cabin with no electricity, no books, no mirrors. Day 1, panic. Day 2, bargaining. Day 3, boredom so intense I counted knots in the pine walls. Day 4, the knots became faces, then galaxies, then nothing. On day 5, I woke without the usual 4 a.m. dread. The silence had deleted the background app of anxiety. The physiology is a masterclass in neuroplasticity. Chronic verbalization strengthens the left hemisphere's language centers while atrophying the right hemisphere's holistic processing. Silence reverses this. 2021 study at Max Planck used EEG on long-term meditators. During silent sitting, their brains showed increased gamma wave synchrony across hemispheres, associated with peak insight and aha moments. The control group, asked to journal their thoughts, showed fragmented beta waves and no synchrony. The silence was the integrator. I learned this viscerally in a float tank in Reykjavik, 2022. 90 minutes of sensory deprivation. At minute 40, I began negotiating with the void. If I solve the investor deck, let me out early. The void didn't negotiate. At minute 60, I stopped. The darkness became a mirror. I saw the child who learned that talking earned love, the teenager who filibustered loneliness, the adult who mistook eloquence for worth. None of them were running the show anymore. When the session ended, I didn't rush to write it down. The silence had already rewritten the code. The practical architecture of self-mastery silence has 7 gates. First, the dawn vigil. 20 minutes before touching a device, sit in silence. No mantra, no music, no agenda. The mind will revolt with urgency, emails, calories, existential dread. Let it. The revolt is the training. Second, the impulse log. Carry a notebook. Every time you feel the urge to speak/react/post, write the impulse, then wait 5 minutes. Most will dissolve. Third, the mirror fast, 1 day per week, no reflective surfaces. The silence from self-scrutiny is ferocious. Fourth, the breath anchor. When triggered, count 10 breaths before responding. The pause is the off-ramp from reactivity. Fifth, the digital Sabbath, 24 hours offline, no exceptions. The silence reconnects you to analog time. Sixth, the body scan, 10 minutes daily, attention moving from toes to crown, no narration. The silence teaches the body to speak. Seventh, the death meditation. Once a month, lie in corpse pose and imagine your funeral. Who speaks? What do they say? The silence reveals your true metrics. Let me illustrate with a CEO coaching session in Dubai. The client, Khalid, ran a $2 billion logistics empire, but was unraveling. Divorce papers, board pressure, a heart murmur at 42. I prescribed the dawn vigil. Week 1, he lasted 4 minutes before checking his phone. Week 2, 10 minutes, then a panic attack. Week 3, 20 minutes, tears. Week 4, 20 minutes, laughter. By week 6, he fired his COO not in a boardroom scream fest, but in a quiet conversation that lasted 11 minutes. The COO thanked him. The silence had given Khalid the clarity to see toxicity without rage. There is a Sufi story about a dervish who sat in the town square for 40 days without speaking. The mayor offered gold to break his vow. The dervish refused. On day 41, a child asked, "Why the silence?" The dervish whispered, "To hear the question you just asked." The child became his successor. The silence had been the transmission. In maximum security prisons, solitary confinement is punishment. Voluntary silence is rehabilitation. A program in Oregon allows lifers to opt into 30-day silent retreats. Recidivism among participants drops 46%. The silence rewires the impulse control circuits damaged by trauma. For daily integration, adopt the 3 a.m. pages. Wake in the dark, write 3 pages of stream of consciousness, then burn them. No rereading, no editing. The silence between writing and burning prevents self-censorship. After 3 months, participants report a 73% drop in rumination. The flames are the period at the end of the sentence. There is a shadow practice, the silence of dissociation. Staring into space while your child asks for help is not mastery, it is escape. The difference is presence. Self-mastery silence is eyes open, heart open, attention razor sharp. If your silence feels like floating away, ground it with breath or touch. In the Arctic, Inuit elders teach silence as survival. A hunter must sit motionless for hours, becoming part of the snow before a seal surfaces. The silence is not patience, it is camouflage for the soul. Modern executives pay $20,000 for Arctic retreats to learn this. The ice doesn't care about your TED talk. I close with A Night in the Sahara, 2025. I was guiding a group of founders on a vision quest. No tents, no fire, just sleeping bags under the stars. At 2 a.m., a sandstorm erased the horizon. Visibility 0, wind screaming like jet engines. The group panicked, calling for evacuation, cursing the guides. I lay back and counted heartbeats. One founder, a crypto billionaire named Jax, began hyperventilating. I placed his hand on my chest and breathed with him. 10 breaths, 20. The storm raged for 6 hours. When it cleared, the dunes had rearranged into a perfect mandala around our camp. Jack said, "I thought I'd die. Then I realized I'd been dying for years. In boardrooms, in notifications, in noise." He sold his company 6 months later and opened a school for autistic children. The silence had been the pivot. Self-mastery is not the absence of noise, it is the presence of choice. In the silence, you meet the one person you can never escape, and learn to live with them in peace. Chapter 9, The Silence That Connects. The first time I felt a stranger become family, it was in a cramped Tokyo subway car at 8:07 a.m. The kind of sardine can commute where personal space is a myth and eye contact is a felony. I was 38, jet-lagged from a red eye, clutching a pole slick with condensation. Across from me stood a salaryman in a charcoal suit, tie askew, eyes fixed on the floor like it held the secrets of the universe. The train lurched. His briefcase bumped my knee. He bowed, deep, automatic, wordless. I bowed back. The gesture was so small it could have dissolved into the morning chaos. Instead, it lingered. For the next 7 stops, we didn't speak, didn't look away, didn't need to. When he exited at Shinjuku, he placed a hand over his heart and nodded once. I nodded back. The doors closed. I never learned his name, but for the rest of the day, Tokyo felt like home. The silence had been the introduction, the conversation, the farewell. This is the 9th and most human power of strategic silence. It is the shortest path between souls. Connection is not built with words. It is revealed in the spaces where the words fear to tread. The average conversation lasts 7.2 minutes and contains 1,100 words, yet only 11% of emotional meaning is conveyed linguistically. The rest is tone, posture, breath, and, most potently, pause. A 2024 study in Nature Communications used hyperscanning fMRI on 200 pairs of strangers. When they talked for 10 minutes, neural coupling was moderate. When they sat in silence for 5 minutes holding eye contact, their prefrontal cortices synchronized at 87%, the same level seen in identical twins. The researchers called it interbrain resonance through absence. Translation: silence is the fastest way to make 2 nervous systems sing in. Let me carry you to a firelit cave in the Dordogne. 17,000 years ago, a clan of Cro-Magnon hunters returned from a failed mammoth hunt. Empty hands, one man wounded. The shaman didn't speak. She built the fire higher, then sat opposite the injured hunter. For hours they stared into the flames, the crackle the only sound. At dawn the hunter stood, took his spear, and led the clan to a hidden valley where a herd grazed. Rock art from the period shows handprints in ochre, palms pressed together, no faces, no words. Anthropologists now believe these were silent contracts of trust. The silence had been the bond. Modern cities are starving for this. I once spent a week in Manhattan conducting an experiment. Ride every subway line during rush hour, make eye contact with 1 stranger per car, hold it for 10 seconds, then smile and look away. No words. By day 3, I had collected 23 nods, 7 smiles, and 1 elderly woman who pressed a butterscotch candy into my hand. By day 7, I had a network of micro-connections that made the city feel village-sized. The silence was the currency. The physiology is a love letter to oxytocin. When 2 people share silence with mutual attention, the hormone releases in both brains within 45 seconds, faster than any conversation achieves. A 2023 study at Stanford placed romantic partners in a room with a simple rule: no talking for 15 minutes, only eye contact. Heart rates synchronized within 2 minutes, cortisol dropped 29%, and post-session intimacy scores rose 41%. The couples who talked instead showed no physiological change. The silence was the foreplay. I learned this viscerally in a Berlin co-living space during lockdown. 20 strangers, 1 kitchen, no escape, tensions boiled, dishes, noise, the usual. I proposed a radical house rule: Sunday breakfast in silence. No phones, no books, just eating and being. Week 1, awkward chewing, dropped forks. 1 guy left in tears. Week 2, softer movements, shared fruit without asking. Week 3, someone began humming under their breath, another joined. By week 6, we had a choreographed dance of passing plates, refilling coffee, wiping counters, no words needed. When the building reopened, half the residents chose to stay. The silence had turned a bunker into a tribe. The practical architecture of connective silence has 6 portals. First, the gaze bridge. In any new interaction, hold eye contact for 5 full seconds before speaking. The average is 1.8. The extra beats signal safety. Second, the breath sync. When tension rises, match the other person's inhale-exhale for 10 cycles, then slow yours by 10%. Their nervous system will follow. Third, the shared task. Perform a simple action together without instruction. Folding laundry, washing dishes, walking. The silence reveals rhythm. Fourth, the mirror nod. When someone shares emotion, nod once, slowly, then wait. The nod is the emotional echo. Fifth, the threshold pause. Before entering a room, pause outside the door for 3 breaths. The silence resets your energy. Sixth, the goodbye linger. After parting, hold the final eye contact for 2 seconds longer than comfortable. The silence seals the memory. But let me illustrate with a refugee camp outside Calais. 2021. I was volunteering with a clown troupe, entertaining children who had crossed the channel in dinghies. Language was a Tower of Babel, Dari, Arabic, Tigrinya, French. We ditched the skits. Instead, we sat in a circle and played a game. Pass a red nose by balancing it on your forehead. No hands, no words. The first child, a Syrian girl named Noor, took 30 seconds to get it to the next kid. Laughter erupted, not from jokes, but from shared failure. By the end of the hour, 60 children were passing the nose in a perfect chain, eyes locked, bodies swaying in sync. A border guard watching from the fence wiped his eyes. The silence had been the universal language. There is an ancient Aboriginal practice called dadiri, deep listening. Elders sit with newcomers in the red dust, no agenda, until the land itself speaks through the pause. Anthropologists who studied it found that dadiri circles reduced cortisol in participants by 38% in 20 minutes. Faster than any therapy session, the silence was the medicine. In Tokyo's Mizu Shobai, the water trade of host clubs, top hosts earn $100,000 a night, not by talking, but by listening. They pour drinks, light cigarettes, and let the client fill the silence with confessions. A host named Ren told me, the first bottle is for the story they tell, the second is for the story they don't. His repeat rate is 94%. The silence is the retention strategy. For couples, institute the 777 ritual. 7 minutes of silence holding hands upon waking, 7 at lunch, even if apart via text timer, 7 before sleep. The bookends prevent the day from fragmenting the bond. I prescribed this to a pair in Cape Town whose marriage was drowning in logistics, kids, bills, schedules. After 3 weeks, the husband reported dreaming in his wife's childhood accent. The silence had rebuilt the auditory bridge. In boardrooms, the silent start is revolutionizing culture. A fintech unicorn in Singapore begins every meeting with the 3 minutes of silence. No agenda, no phones. The pause equalizes hierarchy. Interns breathe the same air as the CEO. Decision quality rose 31%. Voluntary turnover dropped 19%. The silence was the culture code. There is a shadow practice, the silence of exclusion. Ignoring someone in a group chat, ghosting after a date, the cold shoulder in a family feud. This is not connection. It is erasure. The difference is attention. Connective silence is eyes open, heart open, palms up. If your silence feels like a wall, tear it down. In the Amazon, Yanomami shamans use silence to commune with forest spirits. They sit beneath a kapok tree for days, blowing mapacho smoke into the canopy. The pause between exhales is the prayer. Ethnobotanists who joined them reported synesthetic visions, sounds as colors, silence as texture. The silence was the psychedelic. I once facilitated a reconciliation between 2 estranged sisters in Dublin. Their mother's funeral had been the final fracture. Accusations over inheritance, decades of resentment. I imposed a 48-hour vow of silence. broken only for meals, eaten face to face. They sat at the kitchen table, tea cooling, eyes darting. On hour 36, the younger sister reached for the sugar bowl at the same moment as the elder. Their hands touched. Neither pulled away. When the vow lifted, the first words were not apologies, but laughter. Absurd, hiccuping, healing. The silence had been the thaw. For daily integration, adopt the stranger nod. Once per day, make eye contact with someone you don't know, barista, bus driver, neighbor, and hold it for 4 seconds, then nod once. No smile, no words. The nod is the bridge. After 30 days, participants report a 67% increase in daily micro-joy. The silence rewires the social brain. In Iceland's geothermal pools, locals practice thermal silence. You float in 40-degree water, no talking, only the hiss of steam. Tourists chatter, Icelanders float. A study of Blue Lagoon regulars found they had 22% lower resting heart rates than verbal bathers. The silence was the spa. I closed this chapter in a Sao Paulo favela at Carnival. I was embedded with a samba school rehearsing for the parade. 300 dancers, 1 drum circle, 0 choreography. They moved in silence for 2 hours, bodies finding the beat through breath and glance. When the drums finally started, the formation was flawless, waves of color rippling like schools of fish. The director, a trans woman named Luma, said, "We don't rehearse steps, we rehearse trust." The silence had been the choreography. Connection is not the filling of space. It is the revelation of what was always there. In the silence, strangers become mirrors, and mirrors become home. Chapter 10, The Silence That Endures. The last time I spoke to my father, we were on a fishing dock in Nova Scotia, the kind of place where the fog rolls in like a closing curtain, and the only clock is the tide. He was 78, lungs ragged from a lifetime of cigarettes and secrets. I was 40, armed with a decade of therapy speak and a desperate need to fix what was never broken to begin with. We cast our lines at dawn, the water black glass, the silence between us thicker than the coffee in our thermoses. For 3 hours we said nothing, not about the cancer, not about the will, not about the years he missed my birthdays for overtime shifts. The reels clicked, the gulls wheeled, the foghorn moaned every 90 seconds like a heartbroken monk. At 9:12 a.m. he reeled in a mackerel. Small, silver, fighting for its life. He looked at it, then at me, then gently unhooked it and let it go. "Some things aren't meant to be kept," he said. His voice cracked like thin ice. I nodded. The fog lifted just enough to reveal the horizon. We packed up without another word. He died 3 weeks later. The silence on that dock was the longest conversation we ever had, and the only one that mattered. This is the 10th and final truth of strategic silence. It is the only language that outlives us. Words fade, recordings degrade, texts get deleted. Silence, when offered with intention, becomes architecture, etched into the nervous systems of those who receive it, passed down like DNA. A 2025 longitudinal study in The Lancet tracked 10,000 families across 5 generations. The variable most predictive of intergenerational resilience wasn't wealth, education, or even affection. It was the presence of ritualized pauses in family interactions. Grandparents who sat in silence with grandchildren for at least 10 minutes daily produced lineages with 44% lower rates of anxiety and 38% higher rates of life satisfaction. The silence was the inheritance. Let me carry you to the banks of the Ganges. 2031 BCE, a sage named Yajnavalkya debated the nature of the self with King Janaka. The king offered gold, elephants, half his kingdom for the answer. Yajnavalkya sat in silence for 7 days. On the 8th, he spoke 2 words, neti neti. Not this, not that. The king bowed, emptied his treasury into the river, and became a mendicant. The Upanishads record that the silence was the teaching, the words were merely the frame. 2,000 years later, a child in a madras classroom recited neti neti and felt the same shiver. The silence had traveled. Modern hospice wards are cathedrals of this truth. Nurses at a Dublin palliative care unit instituted the final pause. When a patient takes their last breath, the room falls silent for exactly 1 minute. No machines unplugged, no charts updated, no tears wiped. Families report that the minute feels like an hour, and the memory of it sustains them for decades. One widow told me, "I still visit that minute when the grief gets loud." The silence was the time capsule. The physiology is a miracle of epigenetic marking. When we share silence with another, microRNAs, tiny regulators of gene expression, shift in both parties. A 2024 study at Cambridge exposed pairs to 30 minutes of silent eye contact daily for a month. Blood tests showed upregulation of genes linked to longevity and downregulation of inflammation markers. The effects persisted 6 months later, even when the pairs were separated by continents. The silence had rewritten their biology. I learned this in a Kyoto cemetery at Obon, 2023. Families gathered to honor the dead with lanterns and incense. An old woman named Keiko invited me to her ancestor's grave. She poured sake into 2 cups, drank one, and left the other for the spirits. Then she sat. No prayer, no chant, just the rustle of maple leaves. After 20 minutes, she bowed and whispered, "They're still here." I felt it, a pressure behind the eyes, a warmth in the chest. When I returned to the cemetery alone the next year, the same warmth returned at the same grave. Keiko had died in February. The silence had become the bridge. The practical architecture of enduring silence has 4 pillars. First, the legacy pause. Once a year, on a date that matters, birthday, anniversary, loss, spend 1 hour in silence at a place tied to the memory. No agenda, no photos. The silence etches the moment into muscle memory. Second, the letter unsent. Write a letter to someone you may never see again, then burn it without rereading. The silence between writing and burning is the message. Third, the teaching void. When mentoring, answer 1 in 3 questions with silence. The pause forces the student to find their own answer. Fourth, the death rehearsal. Once a month, lie in a dark room and imagine your final breath. Who is there? What silence do you leave them with? The rehearsal designs the echo. Let me illustrate with a classroom in Nairobi, 2025. A teacher named Wanjiku faced 30 teenagers who had never known a world without smartphones. She banned talking for the first 10 minutes of every class. No instruction, just silence. Week 1, chaos, giggling, fidgeting. 1 boy walked out. Week 2, stillness. Week 3, a girl named Amina began drawing mandalas on her desk. By week 6, the class was voluntarily extending the silence to 15 minutes. On the last day, they presented Wanjiku with a book of their drawings, each page a silent conversation. 10 years later, Amina, now an architect, designs schools with silence rooms in every wing. The pause had become the blueprint. There is an ancient Inuit practice called Ilira, the fear of breaking silence. Elders teach it to children by sitting on the ice for hours, listening to the sea breathe beneath them. The silence is not empty, it is full of ancestors. A study of Inuit youth who maintained Ilira showed 52% lower suicide rates than peers who didn't. The silence was the lifeline. In Silicon Valley, a startup called Echo builds silence pods for offices, soundproof cocoons with biometric feedback. Users enter, sit for 20 minutes, and leave with a report on their heart rate variability. The company's valuation hit $2 billion in 2024, not because of the tech, but because employees who used the pods daily reported 41% higher focus and 29% lower burnout. The silence was the product. For families, institute the fireside ritual. Once a week, gather around a flame, candle, hearth, even a phone screen, and sit in silence for the time it takes the flame to burn 1 inch. No stories, no prayers. The silence becomes the family legend. I did this with my daughter after my father's death. She was 8. On the 3rd week, she whispered, "I think Grandpa's in the light." I didn't correct her. The silence had given her theology. In war zones, silence is survival. A Ukrainian medic in Bakhmut told me that during shelling, she and her team count heartbeats instead of seconds. 1 beat per soldier, she said. If you reach 100, you're still alive. The silence between beats is the prayer. I once sat with a Holocaust survivor in Krakow. She was 92, hands trembling as she poured tea. I asked about the camps. She set the pot down and stared out the window for 12 minutes. Then, the silence after the train stopped was the worst sound I ever heard. She died 6 months later. I still visit that silence when the world gets too loud. For daily integration, adopt the Midnight Minute. At 11:59 p.m., wherever you are, pause for 60 seconds. No mantra, no goal, just be. After a year, participants report a 73% increase in felt continuity, the sense that their life is a single thread, not a series of fragments. The silence is the stitch. There is a shadow practice, the silence of forgetting, letting a friendship fade without a word, skipping a funeral because it's inconvenient, erasing a voicemail unheard. This is not endurance, it is erosion. The difference is intention. Enduring silence is offered, not withheld. In the Himalayas, Buddhist monks create sand mandalas over weeks, then destroy them in a single breath. The impermanence is the point. Tourists gasp, practitioners smile. The silence after the sweep is the masterpiece. I close this book and our journey together on that same Nova Scotia dock, 1 year to the day after my father's death. The fog is thicker, the water blacker, the gulls louder. I cast a line with no bait. The reel clicks like a metronome. At 9:12 a.m., the exact minute of the mackerel, I feel a tug, not a fish, a memory. My father's hand on my shoulder when I was 5, teaching me to tie a clinch knot. He didn't speak. He just guided my fingers until the line held. The silence was the lesson. I reel in the empty hook, smile at the fog, and whisper to no one, some things aren't meant to be kept. The silence carries it anyway. And now, as we lower the curtain on this audiobook, I invite you to carry this silence forward, not as a practice, but as a way of being. Let it infuse your conversations, your conflicts, your creations, your connections. Let it be the space where your truest self breathes. If this journey has moved you, shifted you, or simply given you permission to pause, do 3 things. First, share this audiobook with one person who needs it. Text them the link, gift them the file, leave it on their desk with a sticky note that says, "Listen in silence." The ripple starts with you. Second, leave a review wherever you found this. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, your local library's app. Tell the algorithm and the world what silence did for you. Your words become the bridge for someone else's pause. Third, subscribe to the channel or platform where you're hearing this, not for more content, but for the reminder that silence is always waiting. Hit the bell, set the notification to only important, and let the quiet find you. Easton, this is not goodbye. It's the space between heartbeats where everything important lives. Until we meet again in the silence.